Few anticipated what transpired when Princess Anne and Catherine stood in front of the cameras, a moment so unvarnished and heartbreaking that it stopped the palace in its tracks. When discussing Prince Louis, the one royal who is rarely mentioned, both women, who were stoic in their own right, broke down in public. However, what caused this emotional breakdown? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. It had begun as a private charitable event with no intention of attracting public notice. There had been no official notice from the royal press office. Thank you. A tiny, approved documentary crew was following Anne's charitable endeavors. There were no cameras from mainstream networks. It wasn't until the very last minute that Catherine's existence was confirmed. However, insiders claim that as soon as Prince Louis's name was spoken, the mood changed. Normally calm and straightforward, Anne stopped in the middle of her speech. Catherine reached for her glass of water, but was unable to lift it. No one knew how to handle the intangible weight that hung over the occasion. Then it broke. Anne dropped her head first, clearly shaking. Catherine got tears in her eyes. "There's so much they don't know," she said, her voice breaking as she finally spoke. Royal attendants hurried to stop the feed in a matter of seconds. While some attempted to block the cameras, others whispered into earbuds. However, it was too late. More significantly, those 6 seconds of uncontrollable emotion had already been witnessed and recorded. The audience was in disbelief as the women were led off stage. In a world governed by etiquette, they weren't sure if they had just witnessed something genuinely unscripted. The atmosphere at the palace became wild. Within an hour, a crisis meeting was called. Protocols for damage control were started. However, what the palace chose not to make public was the true tale, not the video. According to reports, Anne and Catherine wrote a pre-approved joint statement days ahead of time, purportedly to address speculations about Prince Louis's continued absence from public life. However, such comment was never made public. Inside the palace, sources claim that King Charles personally stepped in and told the press office to wait. There was no formal explanation, and the only public action was a press release that used ambiguous wording to describe the event as intensely personal and emotionally charged. But this just served to fuel the fires. Social media was ablaze with speculation when the video was leaked in a matter of hours and went viral under the hashtag #LouisTruth. The manner the royal machine attempted to make it vanish was what really unnerved a lot of people, not just the collapse. Behind golden doors, palace insiders whispered of emotional exchanges and hushed silences. No refusals, no explanations, just quiet. In the realm of royalty, silence also conveys a lot. No one in the royal family was ready to deal with the tidal surge of discoveries and silent confessions that followed. Behind Kensington Palace's opulence is a room full of secrets and tales that are kept out of the public eye. Rumors about Prince Louis's illness were disregarded for years. What had Anne and Catherine been concealing up until now? Something much more intimate was silently taking place inside Kensington's walls, while the world was distracted by royal visits, ceremonies, and other events that were either planned by palace PR. Once the gregarious, lively youngster who was briefly seen in public, Prince Louis has gradually faded from view. His absence, which had been slight at first, was now obvious. There have been no appearances for months. Not a shadow behind a curtained window, no school pictures, no family outings. The public's perception of the youngest Wales offspring seemed to have vanished. There were theories among royal insiders. Some mentioned health problems, while others whispered about being overly cautious. However, there was a much more concerning reality simmering behind the rumors. Employees who were close to the family started to see trends. Louis had stopped laughing in the hallways and spoke openly. His reserved demeanor apparently alarmed his teachers, who noted that his eyes appeared too worn out for a young boy. However, these observations were not well received. They were captured on tape. After that, they were buried. Confidentiality was maintained when medical consultants were called in. Even senior aides were instructed not to divulge their conclusions, if any, which are still hidden in sealed papers. Always extremely protective of her children, Catherine had become more lonely. She demanded to cut back on external interactions, turn down interviews, and postpone engagements. It was once referred to as family time. However, it soon became evident that something was being protected, something brittle. According to reports, she contacted experts using pseudonyms in order to avoid any media leaks and rejected the first suggestions made by experts selected by the palace. The change was even apparent to her closest acquaintances. She was worn out, tense emotionally, and reserved. Anne intervened at that point. Princess Anne, who was well known for her straightforward manner and keen intuition, started paying Kensington surprise visits. She was said to have been shaken by what she saw. Mother and son's relationship remained strong, but it was strained by anxiety and a mutual sense of powerlessness. According to sources, Anne and Catherine spent a lot of time together in the gardens, reading handwritten notes and documents and whispering to each other. And gradually, a silent understanding between the two women started to take shape. It was dubbed a decision pact by some. Although the specifics of that agreement are still unknown, its effects are felt at every level of the royal family. Some claim that Anne told Catherine to prevent Louis from attending royal events for as long as possible. Others think the agreement included a promise to address the monarchy head-on if Louis's illness was ever misused or misinterpreted. It is also implied that Anne threatened to resign from her own responsibilities if she was made to remain silent. Meanwhile, medical professionals have declined to comment. Regarding Louis's condition, not a single official comment has been released. Comment requests are received with icy silence. Whatever is being safeguarded within Kensington has sufficient strength to subvert accepted royal convention. And as the emotional toll increases, people are shouting questions instead of whispering them. However, the emotional cost of silence was becoming intolerable for the women involved, even as the palace protected its secrets. I appreciate you watching. It was desperation, not simply maternal instinct. With trembling hands and a warning, Princess Anne made her midnight appeal to her brother, King Charles. We were losing him. Why did she feel the need to speak up so quickly and defy royal protocol? Anne had been the iron pillar of the monarchy for many years. She was calm, collected, and frequently written off as distant. But in the dark of night behind the walls of Clarence House, she was neither calm nor collected. She was frightened. Something had shifted in Anne after weeks of strained silences and whispered conversations with Catherine behind the castle doors. She was unable to bear the burden of quiet any longer. She called Charles without warning, without a plan, and in a way that was unusual for her, defying every principle of discretion that had been instilled in her since she was a young child. When Anne arrived, Charles was still in his private quarters, apparently taken by surprise. There were no advisors, aides, or press secretary present for the more than hour-long meeting. Only the two of them, royals by blood, but siblings by obligation. Those closest to the king remember his demeanor afterward as haunted. But what Anne said in that room is still considered unofficial. One source claims that Anne began with a terrifying statement. No one is noticing him as he slips between the cracks. There was no denying the necessity. Instead of speaking hypothetically, Anne provided examples. The behavior of withdrawal, the erratic emotions. Nobody dared to identify the indicators of estrangement. She expressed her concerns that Prince Louis was failing from within, even though he was surrounded by the greatest of the monarchy. She also made it apparent that neither employees nor experts were entirely to blame. It was perched above Charles's own crown. Charles, however, did not respond as Anne had intended. Yes, he paid attention, but he kept thinking about how this would affect how the public saw the Wales family. He expressed worries about possible leaks, press interference, and the possibility of misunderstandings. It was more of the same image than intervention, in Anne's opinion. She reminded him unequivocally that Diana had once been destroyed by the monarchy's silence. She reportedly told him, her eyes wet, "We promised we wouldn't let that happen again," before threatening him. Resolve, but not maliciously. Never having courted the spotlight or played media games, Anne warned Charles that she would speak, not as a princess, if the palace stalled any longer, as an aunt who refused to watch helplessly as a youngster languished behind velvet curtains rather than as a royal. She cautioned that she would voice her concerns through public statements, humanitarian activities, and even off-the-record disclosures if needed. It was a promise, not a request. The king was slow to react. The room was silent for much too long. That stillness for Anne was the affirmation she was afraid of. She knew the fight was only getting started as she walked slowly and heavily out of Clarence's house. However, a second wave of internal uprising, this time from inside Catherine's own circle, broke out before Charles could react. Until she wasn't, Catherine was always calm and collected. She confessed to a former assistant at a vulnerable and tired moment, which permanently altered the story. "I have no idea how to get in touch with him anymore." A cornerstone of the contemporary monarchy was the image of Catherine, poised, exquisite, and infinitely graceful. She stood for consistency, coziness, and maternal power. Behind that picture, however, was a lady engaged in a struggle that few were aware of. She had been juggling a reality that was at odds with the narrative the palace presented for months: an ideal home, a perfect family, and an ideal heir. However, her youngest child, who used to be the light in every room, was getting farther and farther away from her. After yet another trying day with Louis, Catherine finally broke down the facade on one of those restless nights. A devoted but retired former staffer had received an invitation to take a private stroll around the palace grounds. Small talk, updates, and niceties kicked off the conversation. However, Catherine spoke the words that had been tearing her apart as they walked, and the quiet between them got thicker. "I no longer know how to get in touch with him." Surprised, the aide remained silent. Catherine went on. She talked about the empty stares, the abrupt silences, and the bewilderment in his eyes. She acknowledged that she had tried everything: changing habits, relieving strain, and even seeing private doctors who weren't part of the palace's recommended network. Worst of all, she thought the palace itself was exacerbating the situation because nothing was working. She talked about being duped into thinking it was only a phase, about advisors subtly pressuring her to minimize worries, and about well-written medical reports that never matched what she witnessed on a daily basis. She started to wonder if Louis's actions were being misinterpreted or purposefully disregarded in order to maintain a story. It wasn't simply Louis who was afraid. Under the pretense of reassurance, she was gradually being forced into silence for her own sake. The most agonizing admission of all followed. At school, there had been an incident: disintegration. During recess, Louis allegedly secluded himself in a storage area and remained silent for hours. His hands were shaking when he was discovered, and he was unable to identify his teacher. The incident was swiftly erased and reframed as a moment of exhaustion, despite the school's prompt notification to the palace. The employees were told not to discuss it. Catherine disclosed that William wanted to think it was an exaggeration. He held on to routine, but Catherine knew better. Unbeknownst to Catherine, the former aide recorded the exchange that evening, for protection, not for treachery. According to reports, reading this confession served as a spark that set off a series of events that would tear apart the palace's meticulously maintained facade, should she ever quiet the note. It just took 6 seconds or one clip to reveal the story. A frightening scene was captured on camera by a palace employee during a private family gathering. Royal handlers took action to get the footage completely erased. However, it was leaked. Within hours, the video suddenly surfaced on every site, initially on an anonymous account. It wasn't very good. However, it wasn't necessary. There was no denying the content. Standing at the periphery of a small group, Prince Louis appeared overwhelmed, his hands shaking, his eyes buried in thought. There was muffled background noise. Not enough, though, to ignore the air's harshness. The man's voice was strained and forceful. "This isn't helping, Catherine," William stated clearly, while hers, which was softer but still cracked, said, "He needs time." "Why are you unable to view that?" Then the camera gave a start. The recording had been noticed by someone. The video ended. However, it was sufficient. The palace went into full defense gear in a matter of hours. The footage was dismissed as edited by a representative, asserted that it was misinterpreted, and identified it as a component of a campaign of online misinformation. However, that did nothing but stoke the fire. The raw file was acquired by investigative outlets and forwarded to several forensic teams, time-stamped to the actual day of the alleged private event at Windsor. The results were authentic, unfiltered, and returned promptly. The palace had been exposed, not merely taken by surprise. A digital conflagration ensued. "Where's Louis" number started to gain popularity in more than 20 nations. Posts poured in, some angry, some encouraging. Many people are just devastated. Transparency was demanded. Inquiries became charges. What was the duration of this? Why hadn't anyone been truthful? Even worse, what more was being concealed? There was mayhem inside the palace. Each agency rushed to determine the extent of the damage. Private secretaries and press officers quarreled. Internal audits were started by security to find the leak. However, the public wasn't the only group calling for answers. Within the household, tensions erupted. According to reports, William declined to comment. Enraged, Charles issued an order to completely freeze the media, and two important personalities disappeared in the commotion. Once visible through their charitable endeavors and well-planned events, Anne and Catherine fell mute. No comments, no public appearances, not even a hushed remark. By informal means, the quiet grew for days. The pressure did not, however, lessen. It swelled. The speculation darkened. Theories surfaced. Some said they had silenced Catherine. Others were concerned that Louis had been completely kicked from royal property. The palace's reputation was further damaged by every minute that went by without a reaction, and the family's custom of waiting out the storm was no longer effective. The entire globe was observing. It has nothing to do with controversy this time. It has to do with a kid. And just when it appeared that the situation couldn't get much worse, Prince Harry emerged as an unanticipated ally. He has been called the outsider, the rebel, and the exile. However, Harry's abrupt presence and his terrifying remarks about Prince Louis were not acts of disobedience. The shockwaves went right to the core of the monarchy and were personal. It started with a mysterious post on Harry's long-dormant, hardly followed, and infrequently updated private Instagram account. But the world was watching in a matter of minutes. A single sentence on a black screen written in stark white. "They always forget the youngest." Nobody is looking at the boy. No names, no background. However, everyone was aware of who he was referring to. It wasn't a coincidence. Harry had decided to speak in the face of Catherine and Anne's deafening silence, just days after the bombshell footage of Louis had emerged. It wasn't a jab either. It served as a warning. Meghan, who is conspicuously missing from the story, remained silent. The weight of Harry's comments was further increased by her silence. This was no prank from Sussex. This was Harry. Stripped of his public relations polish, reaching back into a family he had battled so hard to keep his distance from. Not to blame, but to protect. And it was that which rocked people to their foundations. The Sussex spokeswoman issued an official statement within a day. Devastating, brief, and uncensored. Prince Harry knows what it's like to grow up feeling ignored, unheard, and misinterpreted. He observes what is taking place. He has experienced what it's like to be surrounded by individuals who value appearances over personalities. He now addresses them as a father, brother, and uncle rather than a prince. There should never be a youngster who feels invisible. For the first time, someone outside the immediate royal household had mentioned Louis by name. Ever since the quiet started, it didn't end there either. Harry alluded subtly but sharply to recurring cycles and a legacy of emotional blindness. It was obvious that this was about more than simply Louis. It was about what the institution had overlooked after Diana and after him. The people reacted right away. Already shifting in Catherine and Anne's favor, sentiment suddenly turned even more sharply in Louis's direction. On all media, hashtags like #ProtectLouis and #HeIseen were popular. Harry's message was reposted by celebrities. After being suppressed, former palace employees started talking off the record. The story that had previously portrayed Harry as a traitor was now developing into something much more unsettling. Perhaps he was correct. The impact back at Buckingham Palace was devastating. Aides hurried to come up with a counterattack plan, but the damage was already done. The public's trust was broken. A high-profile engagement that week, a public arts event that had been planned for months, was abruptly canceled by King Charles and Queen Camilla. There was no explanation. No other date was specified. According to insiders, Charles himself ordered the cancellation because he was clearly frightened by the global commotion and the growing belief that the monarchy was at odds with its own lineage. However, the mayhem was just getting started. The most shocking discovery, however, was still to come. One that would originate from an outsider with royal secrets rather than a royal. The handwritten notebook of a royal nanny, complete with her observations, anxieties, and confidential letters she never dared to write, was safely stored in a locked vault. Up until now, Prince Louis's inner world has been hauntingly depicted by what she disclosed. The journal, stored discreetly in a locked drawer, had accompanied the nanny over the most trying 2 years of her employment, but it was never supposed to come to light. During what the palace openly referred to as a transitional time, she had been assigned to Prince Louis. However, she filmed something even more disturbing in private. The pages revealed a world far different from the carefully chosen perfection of official photos through meticulously dated entries and incomplete letters. The entries kept coming back to the same phrase, the Red Room. Her writing initially appeared to be juvenile fantasy, but as the months passed, it grew increasingly alarming. The hallway leading to it would be avoided by Louis. The mere mention of it would make him pallid. The nanny also reported that he woke up yelling and say, "Don't put me back there," at least 3 times. Such a room was never acknowledged by the palace. However, employees acquainted with the property attested to its existence. It was formerly a private study that is now seldom ever open. The nanny's descriptions were much more terrifying. Louis was frequently left alone for long stretches of time, which limited his interactions and made his world seem smaller. Long periods of silence, a numbing quiet that didn't feel natural for a youngster, and a sense of withdrawal that appeared to get worse every day were all mentioned in the journal. Despite being instructed to adhere to etiquette, the nanny made an effort to politely and quietly voice concerns. Due of the emotional toll, she made 2 requests for reassignment. They were both turned down. A letter she wrote but never delivered was one of the documents found. It was titled Stark and was addressed directly to Catherine. He's retreating. She begged the Duchess to step in more forcefully in it. He doesn't shed tears. He doesn't yell. He loses himself. I fear we are watching him vanish in real time, she wrote. The letter was never sent. It was folded tightly and nestled between journal pages, possibly too painful to destroy and too risky to transmit. What had started out as flickering headlines and whispered rumors now acquired a tangible, indisputable form. This was not conjecture from the media. This woman had witnessed it happen within the palace, in the same rooms, and was powerless to stop it. She described a pattern of desperation, quiet, and repression. They were not theatrical. They were considerably more menacing because they were unpolished. Still, there was one question that pervaded everything. The Red Room, what was it? The notebook made hints but never provided answers. A frenzy centered around that mystery. Journalists, internet detectives, and even former palace aides offered their opinions. Some people wrote it off as symbolic. Some claimed it contained more. Some contained Klinkol, something the palace was never interested in discovering. As public pressure increased, and there were no more secrets to conceal, the palace was compelled to make a choice that would permanently alter the course of history. No royal etiquette, no news conference, just unadulterated feeling. Princess Anne and Catherine sat side by side and finally spoke in an emergency broadcast that was broadcast on royal channels. An entire country was astonished by what they disclosed. The public had never seen such a picture before. No opulent halls, no formal emblems. There are only two women sitting close to each other on a simple couch, and their faces reflect the gravity of the situation. There was no royal coat of arms in the background, nor was there a prepared introduction. What came next was a reckoning, not a speech. The first person to speak was Anne, whose steady voice carried decades of suppressed conviction. "It has nothing to do with titles," she started. "It has to do with a kid. My nephew, her son." She gave Catherine a quick glance, who was clearly trying not to cry, and didn't wait for the palace's blessing. She didn't use abstract language. She identified the facts, exposed the lies, and acknowledged what the organization had been denying for months. There had been a serious problem, and it had been left uncontrolled. Then Catherine inhaled deeply and started, even though she spoke quietly. Her words were as loud as thunder. "Prince Louis has been diagnosed with a condition that requires intensive emotional support," she disclosed. A condition they had attempted to comprehend in private, but encountered opposition on all fronts. She clarified that internal warnings were suppressed, expert advice was disregarded, and, most terrible of all, her own cries had been downplayed. "I was overreacting," she said, her lips quivering. "We were breaking behind those cameras, but they instructed me to grin for them." No attempt was made to distort the story. The systemic silence, the delayed intervention, and the emotional cost of maintaining the monarchy's refined image were all exposed by Catherine's candor. She made no appeal for pity. She requested awareness. She urged the other families who were observing not to wait. Talk to your youngster if they're having trouble. Talk till someone hears you. Next to her, Anne gave a modest nod. It was a united front, built by pain rather than politics. The monarchy broke down at that same moment, not in frailty, but in veracity. The public responded right away. The tone of talk programs, social media, and even foreign headlines shifted from speculative indignation to one of shared pity. Individuals started telling their own tales. World leaders, pediatricians, and celebrities commended the bravery required to come out. Not everyone, though, was moved. King Charles was not visible during the telecast. Later, palace sources verified that he was observing from Sandringham. However, he did not respond publicly, did not appear, and did not release a statement. His quiet was more powerful than any regal proclamation. And behind closed doors, that quiet sparked a new type of rage from both his own family and the general public. However, a final royal decision rekindled the controversy just when it appeared that all had been resolved. King Charles gave a definitive decree rather than healing. Even his closest advisors were taken aback by it. Catherine and William might have reached a breaking point inside the royal walls as a result of the quick, icy, and irrevocable action. Many had anticipated a public display of unity, a softened statement, a healing gesture from the monarch, or even a private meeting to bring the broken family back together in the wake of the emotional broadcast. However, none of those things happened next. The formal order was signed and distributed over the palace communication system in less than 72 hours. Future royal engagements would no longer include Prince Louis. For his protection, a succinct and clinical explanation was provided. It appeared to be a protective measure to the outside world. However, the message was clear to those in the inner circle. This was not defense. It was taking something away, a silent banishment behind a curtain of worry. Charles had made his choice after consulting with senior courtiers who were more interested in appearances than in healing, not with Catherine or William. Control, not concern, was the aim. According to accounts, Catherine remained silent when she was told of the decree. She just got up, gave one nod, and walked out of the room. She was apparently discovered by herself in the West Garden, wiping away her tears, a few moments later by a staff member. It was tears of betrayal, not shock. Not only from the organization, but also from her own relatives. William, who had been there when the decision was made, remained silent. And that stillness was more painful for Catherine than any royal etiquette could possibly be. The gap between them widened instantly. The weight of the crown he was supposed to inherit crippled William, who was caught between duty and parenthood. According to those closest to him, he thought his son's quiet would preserve the security of the monarchy, but by doing so, he betrayed Catherine's confidence. The man who had previously clashed with her had now opted for caution over bravery after she had stood in front of the world, exposed. Once more, Princess Anne would not keep quiet. She barged into Charles's private study and demanded an explanation, according to palace rumors. She didn't get one. Instead, she received a prepared statement from a personal assistant. The king thinks that everyone will benefit from this. Anne's answer was straightforward but biting. And Louis? She was clear about her stance before she left. The monarchy didn't merit her service if it couldn't support its weakest members. The public's reaction was swift and sharply split. One half believed that the relocation was essential, a hard but necessary step for a child who was having difficulties in the public glare. What it felt like was what the other half termed it: abandonment. It seemed as though the same organization that had mistreated Diana's suffering was now abandoning the one youngster who most needed them. As a result, the royal family stood shattered in plain front of the world, rather than in secrecy. The harm was generational rather than merely personal. And one fact became indisputable as speculation raged about what would happen to Louis, Catherine, and the monarchy itself in the future. Thank you for viewing. Remember to subscribe and like, and we'll see you in the next one.